I'm going to identify the 6 most common barriers to effective listening so you can overcome them. Listening is frequently mentioned as one of the top communication skills that professionals should have but often lack, and I'm going to help you fix that. This video is part 1 in a 4-part series on active listening skills. I posted some videos on listening years ago, but it's time for an update. Many people I know desperately want to be good listeners, but they can't seem to do it because of these 6 barriers. So let me know in the comments section which of these causes you the most trouble personally. The first barrier is distractions. Clearly you won't listen as well if things are distracting you, like your phone, which is the number 1 distraction these days. Noises coming from another room or from outside can distract you. Music in the background can be a distraction. A TV or other monitor in the space can be a distraction visually. Other distractions have nothing to do with sound, like cold air conditioning or a draft that's blowing on you. That's my wife's top distraction. She can't think about or listen to anything else if there's cold air blowing. Whatever the distractions you face, here's a tip for reducing these. You have to get assertive about reducing these distractions. Close doors to block noise, move locations, choose a seat that doesn't face a screen. I never pick a seat that's facing a screen when I'm out to dinner or at an important meeting. Slide your chair closer to sit in a way so you don't have as much in your field of vision to distract you. And don't just try harder to stay off your phone. If you're serious about listening better, research shows that you have to turn off your phone and put it 100% out of sight, like in your pocket or in your bag, to improve your listening. The next barrier is preoccupation. This is related to distractions, but preoccupation happens in your mind. You might start a new conversation with a person, but you're still preoccupied by something you were already thinking about before that conversation. It's hard to let that first thought go and focus entirely on listening because you're preoccupied. You could be anxious about something. Maybe it's social anxiety, or maybe you're anxious about something else that's preoccupying your mind. One major preoccupation I have personally is that I'm always thinking about what I'm about to do next. What's coming up after this conversation? What's coming up later in the day? Those responsibilities make me focus on the future and they preoccupy me. They prevent me from focusing on the moment and being a good listener. You may also get preoccupied by something the other person said. We call this drift. So the other person might say a word, or it could be any word that reminds you of something else in your mind, and that drifts away in that direction while they continue to talk. Preoccupation is a tough nut to crack, but it all comes down to mental discipline. The moment you realize you're thinking about something else, you have to re-engage in active listening. Force yourself to make eye contact. Focus on what they're saying in the moment. Something that helps me is I try to ask a question or make a brief comment about what the other person's saying to keep myself actively engaged and focused. If you're routinely preoccupied, you're likely listening too passively. So when I listen, I ask questions or focus enough to make a comment, and that usually snaps me right back into good listening mode. The third barrier is listening too much to the details. When we get too focused on the details and try to follow every single move in the conversation, we can lose sight of the big picture that the other person is trying to communicate. I've noticed that people who are the most detail-oriented have difficulty following the overall point. So the tip for this is to give yourself permission to focus on the overall big picture of what the person is saying. Let yourself off the hook for keeping track of every detail. Remind yourself that you can always ask follow-up questions later if you're missing something. And when you're listening for the overall message, you're much more likely to tune in and grasp what the other person's saying. A fourth barrier is when the topic itself is boring or uninteresting to you. I've seen this happen a million times in group professional settings. People listen very carefully when it's a topic they care about, and then they start looking at their devices the moment the subject changes to something that doesn't directly involve them. The solution is to check and change your mindset. Develop a sense of curiosity. Make your mind up that you're going to take an interest in what the other person is saying. I heard the comedian Jerry Seinfeld talk about having conversations and listening to people at social gatherings. He said that if you're talking to somebody who's completely boring, you can still look for and find something interesting about almost anybody as long as you decide to take an interest. Many people consider curiosity or taking an interest in the other person a choice, in other words. So if you're not really into the subject the other person is talking about, decide to be curious, and that will help your listening. The fifth barrier to effective listening is called the rebuttal tendency, and this is a big one. Instead of listening carefully to understand, we spend our mental focus trying to figure out what we're going to say next. As the well-known author Stephen Covey once said, most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. He was talking about the rebuttal tendency. You can almost see this sometimes when you're talking to somebody else. They look like they're revving up their engine, just waiting to jump in. But when they do, it's almost impossible for people to listen really well this way to what the other person's actually saying. I've noticed many times when people have the rebuttal tendency, they end up saying things that don't align with where the conversation has gone because they've missed important information while they were calculating what they wanted to say next. They might think they're coming up with something clever, like a comeback or a thoughtful statement, but they end up coming across like they're not following along that well. So the tip has two parts. First of all, make sure you invest your time listening to what the other person is actually saying. Don't try, in other words, to figure out what you want to say next. Just let yourself off the hook for saying anything right away. The second half of the tip is to commit ahead of time to pausing for a few seconds once the other person has finished their talking turn. If you commit to pausing ahead of time, you'll untrain yourself to feel like you have to jump in as soon as they're finished. In my experience, the other person will appreciate that you have paused and taken the time to let them finish. And you usually only need a few seconds to figure out what you want to say in response after that pause because you've been listening carefully. The sixth barrier is that sometimes the speaker, the actual person, is boring, uninteresting, distracting. Maybe they're speaking, for example, in a monotone voice. Maybe they're saying or using other fillers so much that it distracts you. They could be a soft talker and they're just not engaging enough to keep your interest. There's something about them you just can't get over. So the tip for this is whatever their shortcoming, decide to give them grace. Allow them in your mind not to conform to your standards. In the interest of your effective listening, let them off the hook. Have compassion for them. Remind yourself that they're only human and they're likely doing their best. Let go of all expectations that you have on them to be a good communicator, and instead put your focus on their message, on their words. Here's a summary of the top 6 barriers to effective listening and the tips I gave. Let me know which one of these barriers causes you the most trouble, and feel free to share your own tips in the comment section below to help overcome them. Feel free to take a look at my page of full free resources on my website. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Listening is so important because it's the most direct way we connect with other people and build relationships. This channel is all about communicating in professional settings, but good listening will help you strengthen your connection with people in your personal and family life as well. The easiest way to get a picture of what active listening looks, sounds, and feels like is to contrast it with passive listening. And you've probably been on the receiving end of this. You're talking to somebody, and the other person might technically be hearing some of the information you're saying, but they come across as tuned out. They're on autopilot. They're not engaging much with what you're saying, either verbally or non-verbally. And when you're in the role of speaker in these moments, this can be very dissatisfying, disconfirming, and discouraging. It can make you wonder why you're talking in the first place. In contrast, active listening looks, sounds, and feels obvious. Active listening means listening completely. We'll talk more specifics about active listening behaviors in a moment, but I believe there are 2 prerequisites that the best active listeners fulfill. One prerequisite is that you have to commit to listening. That means you have to put aside whatever else might be distracting you. You have to make the other person your top priority. I mention this as a prerequisite because I have frequently talked to clients who tell me they're just not good at listening. The first question I ask them is, have you truly committed to being a good listener? And when they're honest, they'll usually say, well, not really. And that's usually why they're not really a good listener. They just want to be automatically good at listening without making a genuine commitment to it, without making it a priority in every conversation. Good listening is first and foremost a choice that you make every time someone else speaks. The second prerequisite is to accept that good listening takes practice. Listening is a skill, like any other skill. Practice is what makes you improve. It's not automatic. You have to work at it. On the plus side, basic active listening skills are not mysterious or complex. The 4 tips I'll give you in a moment may seem like common sense, but in that light, the question for you is not, do you understand these tips? The question is, are you doing them consistently? First, active listening involves nonverbal communication, and there's 2 sides to this. On the one hand, you're demonstrating that you're engaged and paying attention nonverbally. I saw a bad example of this on a TV show the other day, where there's a leader on the show who has a reputation for not caring about people. One of his employees walked into his office, and the boss continued writing an email, kept his shoulders turned away from the employee, and made only glancing eye contact. In contrast, one of my past supervisors was a great listener. The first thing he would do when you walked into his office was to push away from his computer. If he happened to have his phone out, he would immediately silence it and put it out of sight. He did the exact opposite of the guy on the TV show. And if you can do this, it'll allow you to make good, comfortable eye contact. Your body posture should be open and your shoulders should be oriented toward the other person. On the other side of the coin, good listeners also notice the speaker's nonverbal cues in return. There's an expression that you listen with your eyes. And part of that is eye contact, but the other part is you pay attention and notice what's happening with the other person visually. What kind of mood are they in? Do they look anxious, frustrated, annoyed? You can pick up on that by actively observing their nonverbal cues. Second, active listening involves verbal communication. Again, there are 2 sides to this. The most obvious part is asking good questions. The most common pattern that good listeners demonstrate is that they ask a good question and then they let the other person fully answer it. Picture a good mental health therapist. They are the best listeners. They ask you a thoughtful question and then they stop talking for a while and listen carefully as their clients speak. In a personal and professional situation, you may notice that a conversation will seem to just die suddenly. People just stop talking and you don't know what to say. The most common cause of this is that one or more of the people in the conversation stopped asking questions. So asking questions and listening is one half of the verbal communication process we use for good listening. The other part of verbal communication is those small utterances that show the other person that we're following them. Good listeners demonstrate their listening with what we call back channel cues. They say, I hear you. Yeah, makes sense. They're providing positive verbal feedback that signals to the speaker that they're following along. Often listeners won't even use full words. They might just say, huh. And we call these back channel cues because they only last a brief moment and those utterances don't really represent a full talking turn. If someone says, it doesn't feel like an interruption. It feels like it's happening in the background while the main speaker's words stay in the foreground or on the main channel of communication. But those little utterances do a lot of work. They keep you actively engaged as a listener. They show the other person that you're following them. So second, good verbal communication while listening means asking good questions and then communicating with back channel cues while you pay attention. Third, active listening involves responding to what the person just said. This is part of what some people call reflective listening. And this goes beyond the basic utterances or back channel cues I just mentioned. The pattern starts like this. You ask a question, the other person responds for however long it takes, and then at the end of that talking turn, you give an informed response. Let's say you just ask a person, what have you been working on lately? They tell you that they've been drafting a big presentation that's a stretch for them, but they're excited about it. You actively listen for a while, and then at the end of that talking turn, it's your turn to talk again. This is where you can reflect back to them what you just heard. You might say something like, that sounds exciting, or that's great that you're stretching yourself. You are reflecting back a quick summary of what they've just told you. This makes the speaker feel heard and appreciated. We'll talk more about reflective listening in part 4 of this series when we get to empathetic listening skills. Another way to respond is by asking a follow-up question. I didn't realize you were doing presentations like that. How did you get that opportunity? Most good listeners do both on their talking turn. They use a mixture of reflective statements and follow-up questions. In contrast, what you don't want to do is just look at them blankly and not react when they're done talking. Maybe people have done this to you. You tell them about part of your day or something about your life and they don't react. They just have a stone face. They don't say anything or ask you a question. That's not active listening. So be sure to respond actively to what they just said with a reflective statement or a follow-up question. Fourth, keep the focus on them and let them talk. Now, this tip might seem obvious because we're talking about listening, but I want to be clear about this because it's one of the biggest issues extroverted people like me face when we're listening. When you go into full listening mode, just make a conscious decision that this conversation is going to be all about the other person and not about you. A common listening pitfall, for example, is that we get excited about what the other person just said, and then we jump in too quickly with our own story. Or something they said reminds you of another issue, and you change the subject before they're finished talking. To keep the focus on them, make sure your talking turns and questions are both concise and stick to whatever topic they're interested in. Of course, eventually, once they've done plenty of talking, there will usually be an opportunity later in the conversation for you to share your experiences. In most cases, there'll be plenty of time if you're patient. My rule of thumb is to dedicate at least the first half of the conversation to pure active listening. And if you're not sure how long the conversation will last, err on the side of listening more than talking. Here's a summary of the 2 prerequisites and the 4 active listening tips. Again, the question for you is not, do you understand these tips? Knowing information is just the beginning. The question for you is, are you doing these consistently? And tell me in the comments section which of these tips would make the biggest improvement in your listening. Comprehensive listening is one of the key types of listening that's especially helpful in professional settings. Comprehensive listening means listening to learn, to understand, to comprehend. Some people call this information listening because we do this when we're listening to information, ideas, concepts, and the key parts of a message. Here are some examples of when we do this. Listening to your teachers in school, listening to your coworkers or supervisor's instructions so you can do a job well. Listening to your family or friends to learn how to drive, cook a certain kind of meal, or learn some do-it-yourself home repair knowledge. Comprehensive listening is all about absorbing whatever information or content, as we say nowadays, the other person has to offer. Here are 4 tips to make you an instantly better comprehensive listener, plus a bonus tip at the end that is unique to comprehensive listening in the workplace. First, flip the listening switch. Above all, you must recognize that it's time to listen. As I mentioned in the video in the series on active listening skills, put aside all distractions. Put your phone away, put your other stuff away, so you can give the speaker your full attention, eye contact, and literally lean your body in a bit to put yourself in the right posture and state of mind to learn. Do you know the posture I'm talking about, by the way? When you see a group of athletes in a tight group where all their eyes and ears are on their coach, that's the posture. Those athletes have flipped the switch. When I teach college, I often see a clear difference in the overall attentiveness between the students who sit in the front row and the students who sit in the back row. Those A+ students in the front row give off lots of cues that show me they've flipped the listening switch and they've realized it's time to listen. Everything else disappears when you're tuned in completely to the message. Second, take written notes. I know this might sound old-fashioned, but great listeners still do this. Just like those A+ students, great comprehensive listening usually involves writing things down. I take notes during virtually every important professional conversation I have at work. When I was the chair of my academic department for several years, my supervisor took notes in every single one-on-one conversation I had with him. He was an incredible listener in the moment, but just as important, he didn't rely on his memory alone to absorb and recall what we talked about over the weeks, months, and years. The mere activity of taking notes will help you remember more than listening alone, but you can also refer back to your notes later if you need to. I can't remember everything that people say just by listening. Nobody can. And one habit I have is that I review my notes immediately after important conversations for a few minutes. This almost guarantees that I'll absorb it better. I'm far from a perfect leader, but I'm willing to say that I'm great at following up. Not many things fall through the cracks because I take good notes. And taking good notes also communicates to the other person that you're serious about listening to them. It says, I'm committed to this. I'm writing this down. And here's a tip within a tip. It looks more serious and professional when you use a pen and an actual notebook as opposed to taking notes on a device. In most cases, people will interpret a device as a distraction. We associate phones with texting or photos. We associate laptops with email. So go old-fashioned and take notes with a pen and a notepad. Third, as you listen, mentally separate main points, details, and action steps. When I listen in my head or take notes, I create what looks like an outline, essentially, but you could do this mentally in your head if you aren't in a situation where you can take notes. And here's how it works. As people talk, most speakers have a few main points in any given conversation. They don't always label them, and they may not even realize they have main points, but the overwhelming majority of conversations focus on just a few key topics at a time. And if you listen for these main points, that becomes a structure or a mental schema, and then you can much more easily remember the relevant details that support each of those main points. And of course, sometimes the speaker will want the listener to take action afterward. Again, here's what this would look like in my notes, or at least in my head. I listen for main points, details, and follow-up actions. But there's no magic to my system. I don't write out every detail. I just use keywords, but you should use whatever approach helps you keep track of the main points. Some people's notes look more like a brainstorming sheet with bubbles and connected lines. Frameworks like these provide a mental map that will help you sort, absorb, and later remember the most important information. Fourth, ask clarifying questions. I mentioned this in more detail in the previous video in this series, but it's almost always part of listening for comprehension. When you ask questions, it both helps you understand what's going on, and it signals to the communicator the extent to which you are following along. And the truth is, if you don't ask some questions when you're listening to learn something new, the other person is going to start to wonder if the lights are still on, so to speak. Your questions give the speaker valuable feedback that shows you're sticking with them in the conversation. Now, I don't recommend asking questions that add no value. Don't do any of these behaviors to pretend that you're listening. That's not going to impress anybody. The point is, if you have a question or something isn't clear, then ask a question, a real question, to double check your understanding. And that'll help everybody involved and show them that you're listening and keep you all on the same page. And now for the bonus tip. In some ways, this is the most important tip in the whole video. The tip is to follow through and take action. The key way people will know if you're a good listener is what you do afterward. That's the way other people see it. Think about this for a minute. How many times have you heard somebody say about another person, "Man, I explained it, but he didn't listen"? When they say that the other person isn't listening, they almost always mean some version of the other person is not taking action. They're not following through or doing what they were supposed to do based upon the conversation. You could say the number one proof of good listening is the action you take after the conversation. Now, granted, not every instance of comprehensive listening requires action, but it often will. Now, hypothetically, you could follow all the other tips I explained in this video, but you still won't get credit for being a good listener unless you follow through. Taking action is how you get credit for being a gold star listener. And I consider this a bonus tip because technically it's not part of the definition of listening, but in the real world, what you do after the conversation says the most about how well you listen. Here's a recap of the tips from this video on comprehensive listening. I'd love to hear in the comments section about the tip that you think will help you improve your listening the most. In the first part of the video, we'll talk about what empathy is and is not. And in the second part, I'll give you some concrete tips. Empathetic listening pays special attention to the way the other person is feeling. You do that by putting yourself in their shoes and try to understand where they're coming from. When we listen with empathy, the other person feels understood. This is how a good counselor, therapist, friend, or the occasional supervisor listens to us when they're at their best. Listening with empathy is a real gift that you can give to other people. And we benefit too when we listen this way. Listening empathetically helps us understand how the people around us are doing. That equips us to respond in more helpful ways to the needs of the moment. That's one of the reasons I believe that empathetic listening is a crucial skill for professionals and especially leaders. When you're tuned in to how your people feel, then you'll be more able to meet their needs effectively instead of being out of touch. But the concept of empathy confuses a lot of people, so here's what empathetic listening is not. Empathizing does not mean you necessarily agree with the other person. Listening well does not mean you change your mind automatically based upon what you hear. And here's what I mean. Every parent, teacher, coach, supervisor realizes that the other people they're leading might not, for example, always be filled with enthusiasm. We know that people, for example, get tired, frustrated, burned out. You know what that feels like personally, so you can easily pause and put yourself in the other person's shoes when you get the sense that they may be feeling that way. All you have to do is bring to mind times where you've felt that way and remember what it feels like. That's empathy. Now, just because you're a parent, teacher, coach, or supervisor who knows how they feel, that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to tell your tired son, student, athlete, or direct report that they don't have to take care of their responsibilities. Of course not. That's not what empathizing means. Empathizing, however, means you can adjust how you connect to the other person. Empathy helps you meet people where they are. And when they feel understood, that helps you maintain good, healthy connections with people because they know that you know what it's like. Empathy also does not mean you should try to automatically fix a problem that the other person has. The author Roy Bennett once said, sometimes all a person wants is an empathetic ear. All he or she needs is to talk it out. You've probably experienced this yourself. Something stressing you out at work, or you want to vent about it to somebody you trust. They listen and empathize, and suddenly you feel better. They haven't offered to take any concrete action, but you feel heard and understood, and that's enough. Simply listening is usually all the help you will need to offer somebody. So if you're the type of person who wants to jump in and fix things, remember that empathetic listening doesn't mean solving the person's situation. Maybe at some point they'll ask you for help directly. I'll give you a bonus tip at the end to navigate that moment. But listening with empathy, by definition, does not include that helping fix it stage. So what does empathy look and sound like? Let's talk about 3 overlapping tips to help you get better at this. Now, these might sound like steps, but they all go together. And I'll give you a bonus tip at the end that'll keep you out of trouble. First, empathy has to be genuine. Now, that might seem obvious, but some people hear about empathetic behaviors and they think I'm suggesting faking this or that these are mere superficial tactics they should use. Now, I want to be 100% clear. Empathy is authentic. I'm not suggesting you pretend to care. To be genuine, you have to mentally and emotionally put yourself in the other person's shoes. So as the person is speaking, imagine what it must be like to be in their situation. If the person just told you that somebody insulted them, ask you, how would I feel if somebody had insulted me like that? If they've just lost their job, ask yourself, how would I feel if I have just been fired? If you take the time to do this and allow yourself to feel it, you'll literally feel a sense of compassion, care, and similarity well up in you. Even though I'm using somewhat difficult examples here, you could empathize with people's positive emotions. You could put yourself in their shoes if they've just received some good news. And you should listen empathetically when people are happy and celebrating. That will also have very positive results because you'll be entering their world and sharing their joy. That builds relationships too. And if you've never experienced what they're experiencing, then come as close as you can to recall a time where at least it was something like that. Now, you'll notice so far that we're only talking about what's happening within you internally. That's usually the most significant aspect of empathy. You've not yet shared your own experiences verbally or told them anything specific about your empathy. Listening with empathy is first and foremost about making that genuine effort to see the situation through their eyes, to understand them and feel what they're feeling. Second, pay attention to their verbal and nonverbal communication. In my experience, people will usually show their emotions nonverbally much sooner than they'll explain their feelings verbally. Sometimes their words and nonverbals won't match. Someone might say, I'm fine, but you can tell by their nonverbals that they're clearly not fine. If you pay attention, you can sometimes see little flashes of emotions come across people's faces that say a lot more about how they're feeling than their words. So be on the lookout for these nonverbal cues in professional settings, especially pressured professional settings like deadlines, presentations, important meetings, performance evaluations. Anytime you hear about changes that are happening in someone's life, pay attention and notice how they're doing. They may not say it, but they may show it. Sometimes, of course, they will directly say it. They might come out and say, it's really frustrating, or this is driving me crazy, or I'm burned out. Now, if they come out and say that directly, that's definitely an opportunity to put yourself in their shoes and enter their emotional world a little bit. Third, empathetic listening usually includes reflecting back to them what you sense they are feeling. You'd reflect it back using your verbal and nonverbal skills. Verbally, this means using plain language to say what you're noticing. And unlike comprehensive listening that we talked about in a previous video in this series, listening with empathy does not involve listening for main points, details, and action steps. In contrast, when we're listening to empathize, we're listening almost entirely for the big picture emotion that the other person's feeling. So when we make reflective statements, I recommend that you keep it simple. If they seem frustrated, I might say, "That sounds frustrating." Or if I were in your shoes, I'd feel the same way. If they seem torn between two directions, you might say, "You seem torn." In a related video earlier in this series, we talked about this reflective listening as one possible aspect of active listening, but let's give it a little more detail here. Now, even though therapists and professional counselors use reflective statements when they listen, you'll notice I'm not recommending that you try to analyze, evaluate, or do a detailed interpretation of what they're feeling. The goal is to reflect back what you're noticing in a very simple way. You want to show you're hearing them and understanding them. That's all. For example, if something unexpected happened to them, you might just say, "Wow." That reflects back that you see that they were surprised by something they were telling you, and it gives them space to keep talking about it. If they're telling you about how difficult something is, you might say, "That sounds difficult." If they communicate they're anxious about something, you could say simply, "It sounds like that makes you anxious." Reflective statements show the other person that you are feeling what they are feeling and you understand where they're coming from. And of course, all of those good active listening skills and nonverbal cues we mentioned in the video still apply, like comfortable eye contact, a caring facial expression, good open body posture with your shoulders oriented toward them. In other words, you want to look and sound like you're with them. Before I give you the bonus tip, let's see what these three overlapping parts look like when we put them together. One crucial part is that you do everything you can to enter their world and genuinely feel what they are feeling. Another part is practice noticing how the other person's doing. Are they talking about how they're feeling directly? If not, do you notice how they're feeling by observing their nonverbal cues? It's most important to do this during times of stress that people might be experiencing, like pressure. Third, practice pitching back the big picture emotion that they are feeling using a short reflective statement. If you put all three of these parts together, most people you speak with will soon think of you as a person who listens well with empathy. And now for the bonus tip. What do you do if you have that strong desire to help them fix a problem that they're telling you about? This is really common. And here's what I do. I ask first before I offer help or advice. So after listening, empathizing, reflecting back what I've heard, I pause and I ask them directly, "Is there anything I can do to help?" Sometimes they'll say yes, but most of the time I find that they really just wanted a listening ear. And they appreciate that I didn't jump in with advice or offer solutions they never asked for in the first place. A variation of this is if I'm not sure where they're going in a situation. Usually at the beginning of a conversation, I'll ask. So for example, if the conversation's blurry, I might say something like, "By the way, do you want me to just listen or are you looking for advice?" Now, actually giving advice is a subject for a whole other video beyond the scope of this one, but this is a bonus tip, and that's why it's here. Giving advice is not really considered part of active listening or empathetic listening. As mentioned, this is video number 4 in this 4-part series on active listening skills. If you made it this far and you've watched all 4 videos, please let me know in the comments section. Tell me that you've watched all 4, and I'll give you a heart and say congratulations. As mentioned, be sure to take a look at all the free resources on my website. I'll put links to that in the description below this video. Until next time, thanks, God bless, and I will see you soon.